All right, good morning, everyone. So we are a little bit behind still in our schedule from our syllabus, where we're just starting chapter 5. But I took a sneak peek at chapters 5 and 6, and I think I allocated them a lot more time in the syllabus than they really needed. So I think it's going to work out perfectly. So chapter 5 should take us today and Thursday, and then chapter 6 should be the week after. So we should have plenty of time there, because these are surprisingly short chapters for how much they kind of throw at us. They're also rather interesting. I'm used to teaching sort of the intro level of motivation and drugs and changes of consciousness and stuff, where it's very much a anti-drug lecture in a chapter. And this is a lot more factual, which makes it almost more interesting. So hopefully you guys enjoy it as much as I did. But we're going to get started talking a little bit about psychoactive drugs and then the different specific categories of those. So if we're going to talk about drugs, we should probably give it a definition. So a drug is a medicine or some other kind of substance that changes the body's functioning. So basically something external to our body that can mess with our functioning. And we can have agonists and antagonists. So agonists are the ones that enhance or mimic the functioning of our normal neurotransmitters, and the antagonists will either sort of dampen the effect or block the effect or somehow interfere with the normal functioning of our neurotransmitters. So an agonist could be something that binds to the exact same receptor and activates our neurons the same way a neurotransmitter does. Or an antagonist could be something that binds to that exact same receptor but doesn't activate anything at all. Instead, it just blocks that receptor from being turned on. So with these agonists and antagonists, we're just saying that they're working sort of like or to enhance or against or to dampen our neurotransmitters. But keep in mind that our neurotransmitters can be, I'm drawing a blank on the words there, where they, excitatory and inhibitory, there we go. Oh, apparently it's too early for my brain. But so our neurotransmitters can be excitatory and inhibitory, so they can make it more likely or less likely that a neuron is going to fire. So being an antagonist or an agonist doesn't necessarily immediately correlate to being excitatory or inhibitory, just so that those don't get overlapped. Okay, so those were a lot of terms there, but that's just for sort of drugs in general. This part of the chapter, we're focusing in on psychoactive drugs. So this is specifically drugs, so things, substances that change our body's functioning that specifically have some kind of psychological component to them. So whether that be anxiety relief or relaxation or hallucinations, something along those lines. And as we find, as we get into all of these different kinds of drugs and the different categories of drugs, a lot of them function at a bunch of different levels. So even though we're talking about them as psychoactive drugs, they are very rarely just psychoactive. There's usually other aspects to them. And this will not be an exhaustive list because this is one of those fields that is changing fairly dramatically as time goes on. Okay, so before we get into specific drugs, we can talk a little bit about some of the terms that surround drugs in general. So the first of these is addiction, and this is a preoccupation with obtaining a drug, the compulsive use, and a tendency to relapse after quitting. So this is focusing on the fact that using this particular drug, whatever drug it is, ends up being obsessive for someone. They are focused in on it. It is their focus, their main purpose right now. They are compelled to continue using it, and even if they manage to quit, they still think about it and want to take it again. And we can talk about a bunch of different aspects of addiction, and I believe they come up a little bit later on. But we can continue on with our terminology here. The first is withdrawal. So this is your negative reaction when drug use is stopped. And I teach a class on learning and behavior, and it's interesting that withdrawal is one of those things where it can have a very psychological aspect to it. So this is the negative reaction when drug use is stopped. So when you're taking a drug, your body gets used to its presence. And so you might already understand that concept of homeostasis, where our body wants to maintain balance. And we usually think of homeostasis as maintaining the right blood pH and maintaining the correct body temperature. But it applies to pretty much every aspect of our body, where we are trying to maintain that perfect balance across everything. So when we take a drug that increases the production of a particular neurotransmitter, our brain's going to want to compensate and get back to normal levels. So it will decrease the production of that neurotransmitter. So when we've taken a substance for a long period of time, our body has gotten used to counteracting that taking of the substance. So when we stop taking it, the body still has what are called compensatory responses, where it's compensating for the presence of the drug by acting in the opposite way. So if there was a drug that continually raised your heart rate, if you stopped taking that drug, your heart rate would drop dramatically because there isn't sort of that extra boost from the drug's effects. So your body would sort of swing in the opposite direction when you remove that one aspect of the drug. And this happens across all levels, so it could be neurotransmitter production, it could be heart rate, it could be brain activity, whatever level we want to look at it. That's sort of one of the driving forces. We can start talking about that in terms of tolerance in just a moment here. But first we want to talk about dependence. And so with addiction and dependence, there's sort of a differentiation between the two. So dependence is this need to keep taking a drug to avoid withdrawal, but it's a little bit more than that. It's not just the side effects that can make you want to keep taking the drug. It can also be some psychological aspects. And our textbook makes a point of describing sort of physical versus psychological dependence. But this is one of the first textbooks I've seen that makes the distinction where it isn't sort of one or the other. Physical dependence often has a psychological component, and vice versa. Sorry, did you have a question?
I think you kind of answered it, but I have a boyfriend who has really bad back pain, and so he takes pain medication for that. So he's dependent on it to get rid of the pain, but he doesn't get high or anything, so not that part. So I kind of only wrote that way.
Yeah, and that's kind of almost like the psychological side of it, where a lot of dependence and addiction ends up, it has a lot of negative connotations, even though not all of it is inherently bad. And that's why I really enjoyed this textbook's approach, where nothing is framed overtly negative or positive, which is very refreshing, I must say. But yeah, even with dependence, you can be dependent on things that are helpful. If you take medication for anxiety or depression, that has helped rebalance your brain chemistry. You are dependent on that to continue functioning normally, but it's not a bad thing. So it's kind of us having to separate ourselves from that negative association of the concepts. And so with dependence, it would be more along the lines of you rely on this thing and it's sort of a core part of your life. Addiction is more when it's causing a problem. So that's our way of kind of drawing that line. And then one of the most interesting topics for me is the idea of tolerance. And I've thrown in sort of the next slide here is a very complex, stupid image from another class. This is just for your information. This isn't from our textbook or anything, but I find that I'm a very visual person and I better understand tolerance when it's explained with some examples. And this is a graph that explains tolerance. So I'll walk you through that in just a moment. But tolerance, boiled down to its simplest, is the idea that you need to take more of a particular drug to produce the same effect over time. So the easiest way to think of this is if you started drinking alcohol. The first time you go out, you have a beer and you feel tipsy. A couple of weeks later, going out and having a beer doesn't produce the same effect. So maybe now you have 2 or 3. And so over time, you build up a tolerance, and the same amount no longer produces the same effect. And the reason for that is where this diagram comes in here. So if we have line A is just the response to a drug before conditioning. So if we were in the learning class that this is from, we'd be focusing on sort of those unconscious responses that our bodies do and how we learn something about them, but we can ignore that terminology. That's just saying that when you take a particular drug, you have response A. But I mentioned the fact that your body wants to get back to its normal levels. It wants to get back to homeostasis. So if that graph is showing us heart rate or body temperature or whatever, A is the effect of the drug, and B are those compensatory responses of our body, where we sort of learned that we have to sort of counteract that drug in this way to get back to normal. And then when we look at the bottom, that's actually just averaging the 2 together. So when the drug gets into your system, your body goes, I know what this is, and I know what I need to do to stop it. So it produces those compensatory responses and counteracts that drug response. And so we end up with a much lesser response to the drug because our body has kind of worked around the system to make it lessen. And this can get really interesting because that body response can start happening before you even take the drug. That's where the conditioning aspect comes in and is kind of cool because say when you were learning to drink beers, you would go to the exact same bar every night after a particularly tough class, maybe after a physics lab. And so you'd go to a particular bar, and every time you walk in the door, you're like, yes, this is the place I go. I have a couple of beers, we have fun, we go home. And eventually, just walking into that bar at the right time of day after a particularly tough class, your body's going to produce those compensatory responses, that B graph, even before you take the alcohol. And so your body has learned what it needs to do to stay at homeostasis. And so that can be problematic if your desire is to get a little bit tipsy, but it can also be really dangerous. So what if there's an issue and with lockdown, you couldn't go to a bar. So maybe one of your friends says, okay, well, let's go over to my house and we'll have a couple of beers. It'll be fine. So you go to a new location that your body doesn't know anything about. So you walk into this new place, but you assume that you can drink the way that you did at the bar. So instead of just having a beer, you have 3 or 4 or whatever your usual is. But your body didn't know to start compensating. So that B graph is absent. So instead of having that counteractive effect, we just have the effects of the drug. And we can get a little bit of a response because the body's going to kick in eventually, but especially when you're in a new environment, sometimes it can't kick in fast enough if it doesn't have that advance warning. And that's where a lot of overdoses come from. So people who, say, inject drugs, most of the time when they've had an overdose, it's because they're in a new location. It's an absurd amount of times. I think it's something like 60% of overdoses are because they've never used in that particular location. So this is a massive thing, and all it is our body being sort of advanced prepared for something or not. And you can take the exact same amount, but that background process is what's preventing overdose in other situations. So, as I said, that graph isn't something that you need to know. I just find it a nice way to visualize what's going on with tolerance, as well as overdose, because you can just imagine not having sort of one of those lines. But yeah, a nice, interesting way to illustrate it. Okay. So the next bunch of slides are going to be getting into those specific kinds of drugs and specific categories of drugs. And I just want to hop ahead and make sure, okay, good. My mind was assuming that we were doing depressants first, and I was wondering why the opiates were first, but I just forgot that they were here. So we're going to talk about this category, which is opiates and opioids. So opiates are the ones that are specifically derived from the opium poppy, and these are sort of naturally derived from something that exists in nature. In contrast, our opioids have a similar action. They behave in a very similar way, but aren't directly derived from opium. So they might affect the same receptors, but they don't have that same sort of natural component to them. And the idea was that theoretically the opioids would be a little bit less dangerous and less problematic, but we can see from our list here that heroin is one of those opioids, and we know that that is not necessarily less problematic. So for our opiates, and then I guess logically following opioids, have a couple of different properties that made them desirable. They can be analgesic, which means that they remove pain. They can be hypnotic, helping induce sleep. And they can be euphoric, which means that they sort of create a sense of happiness or ecstasy. So depending on what kind of problems people had, these opiates might be a good solution for that. So if someone is looking to feel good, if they want sort of a happy experience, which is how some people have used it, they would focus on that euphoric aspect. So that enjoyment and happiness. If someone's having trouble sleeping, then that hypnotic aspect helps. Or if someone's in a lot of pain, then that analgesic aspect is beneficial. And opium, as you might know, is something that's been used for centuries. The earliest evidence they have is, what is it here? So 5,700 BCE, where it used to be either eaten or smoked, which is quite an awfully long time. And then morphine was one of the earlier ones where we commonly extracted from opium. And so that was about the turn of the 19th century, and that one was big for pain treatment, especially when surgery started becoming more common. Codeine is one that we see a lot more often nowadays. In my intro classes, I usually show an advertisement for a cough medicine whose major component was codeine, and that's because in addition to stopping pain, it also suppresses coughing because it's actually sort of compressing and preventing things from happening inside your nervous system. So a little bit of overkill there. And then that was sort of another one would be laudanum, which was sort of diluted, I guess, amounts of opium. And that would be good for treating pain. And before they realized how bad it was, again, it was in things like cough medication or even in home remedies to help quiet fretful children. So a lot of things where it was used but probably shouldn't have been.
You might go over this, but does fentanyl fall under this category?
Let me double check my notes. Not that I'm aware of. I know that oxycodone falls under the opioids category, but I don't know off the top of my head where fentanyl falls. If we see it, I'll point it out, but if not, I might just have to look it up. And yeah, it's interesting because a lot of these things have evolved fairly quickly. So even my advertisement for so cough medication, even Coca-Cola, used to have cocaine in it. So there were all sorts of weird things that were perfectly acceptable to society until they figured out just how harmful they could be. And a lot of the, so as I was kind of hinting at before, these opioids, these are the ones that might affect the same receptors, they might behave in the same way as the opiates, but they really aren't as unharmful as they were intended to be. And so when they're saying here, they may affect the same endogenous receptors, that just means that it might affect the same receptors that respond to our naturally produced chemicals, meaning that they bind to the same receptors that our neurotransmitters would bind to. So they could be behaving in the same way as a neurotransmitter. They could be, get the one right, agonistic, or they could be acting against and be antagonistic. And so I mentioned oxycodone, or the brand name for it is OxyContin. And that's one that was supposed to be a lot safer, but now has a strong reputation for being abused in terms of pain relief. And in the US and Canada as well, though most textbooks focus on the US, this sort of abuse of pain pills has become really, really intense, especially because of over-prescribing them. And I've always found it a little bit interesting because my mother was born with both of her hips dislocated, which led to obviously quite a few problems throughout her life. And so she had her first hip replacement before she was 40, and now has had 2 more. And each and every time the doctors have tried to give her opiates. And she is very against that because of family histories of things. And so it's always, yes, you're prescribing it. No, I'm not going to take it. Is there anything else? And most doctors won't give an alternative, which is really harmful. So that's one of those things where we're starting to see a little bit of a turnaround where people are realizing how harmful it can be, but there need to be other alternatives. And then we kind of mentioned very briefly, heroin is one of the most widely abused opiate. And so it's synthesized from morphine, so it's a refined version of morphine. And again, intended to help out, intended for beneficial purposes, but it's 3 times more intense than morphine, and so it was moved to that illegal category eventually. But I found it very interesting because it can still be obtained by prescription in some European countries. So even though it is completely illegal and not used here, it can be prescribed for pain relief after severe surgeries in the UK. So lots of little things we can learn here. Oh, and I had its own slide over here. But that's all right. And we already also covered our endogenous endorphins. Well, we covered the term androgynous. Endogenous, sorry, I always introduce an extra R there. But this is just something that is generated within your own body. So when we're talking about receptors for things that are produced naturally within the body, that would be endogenous. And then endorphins are the body's equivalent of opioids. So those are naturally produced within the body and they interact with those receptors. So when we talk about opioids sort of hijacking or making use of our existing receptors, they're hopping into those receptors designed for endorphins. So behave very, very similar and can sort of function in the same way. Oh, yep.
I'm curious, is there like a negative effect that comes from those endorphins just staying in the synapses and not being absorbed?
Probably. It's kind of a hard one. Like, so the study of pain and what we understand with pain is very not well known. Even a lot of the theories that have been talked about as, yeah, this is probably how it is. It's probably not how it is. But there are some ups and downs to it. So with endorphins, that would be something like you're in a fight with a bear and you're in a lot of pain. And you're aware that you're injured, but that's not your priority. So your endorphins would help you sort of overcome that and continue functioning. But if they stick around too long, then you ignore potentially fatal wounds. So that could be one of those problems. On a regular, everyday kind of effect, I don't think there's any issue with our body overproducing them unless stimulated to overproduce by something else. So if there's a drug that stimulates the production of endorphins, that can cause problems. And then you have the issues of sort of using up resources that you maybe didn't have to begin with, or ignoring pain that you shouldn't. But that's sort of just logical extensions that I can come up with. And this is where sort of one more thing we can chat about here when we talk about opiates and opioids. This is one of those cases that started people to realize that the threat of withdrawal alone isn't necessarily the only thing that keeps people taking these drugs. So even though if you watch those medical dramas where they show that withdrawal from these kinds of drugs can be really harmful and really deadly, in reality, it's a lot more like a bad case of the flu, and it can be harmful, especially if your body's already weakened, but it's not necessarily bad enough that someone would keep taking a harmful drug just to avoid going through a couple of days of really bad discomfort. And so they've kind of shown that a lot of this is, even once you're past that withdrawal phase, even once you've gotten past that sort of really awful couple of days, people who had previously used, especially heroin, are a lot more likely to relapse even long after withdrawal has passed. So 5-10 years after the fact, they can follow up with people, and they're a lot more likely to go back on the drug decades later. So this was one of those things that kind of showed us that it isn't just that physical response, it isn't just avoiding withdrawal. A lot of it is psychological and sort of on that, it's not that I want to avoid the bad of not having it, but I want the good that comes with having it. And that kind of makes it all even more complicated and a lot more difficult, because they then have to treat someone who has previously used heroin or other opiates as someone who for the rest of their life is at high risk of going back on them. So very long term.
Is it the same for other addictive drugs, or just like really strong ones?
It kind of depends. This one is it's one of those key indicators for opiates, just because of the really strong good effects that come with it. In other cases, even something as simple as alcohol has really nasty withdrawal symptoms, especially with prolonged use, and it can be deadly, more deadly to go through withdrawal from alcohol than something like heroin. And so it's like, okay, then it should be easier to stop heroin than alcohol, but it's not. And so it's like, that's where we start getting this more complex view of what we think it should behave as. It doesn't, so there must be something else. But we don't necessarily know what the something else is quite yet. But yeah, I think opiates are the worst for that sort of thing, where it's a really, really long term. But especially with the psychological aspects, that sort of wanting, not a physical craving, but the mental desire, that's one of the hardest parts long term. But I think with the opiates, there is a little bit of physical as well. So yeah, very complex topic. So the next one we can touch on are our depressants. And this is a broad category that overall, they're named depressants because they reduce or depress our central nervous system activity. And for our three main traits that all of these drugs have, they tend to be sedative, so they have calming effects. They are anxiolytic, which I always struggle to say, but it basically means anti-anxiety. So they reduce anxiety and make people feel less anxious. And they can be also hypnotic, again with the hypnotic here, so it can help people sleep. And so alcohol is the most commonly used and abused of the depressants. We could argue that it's one of the most commonly abused drugs overall in all categories, but we're going to focus on it in the depressant category. And it's actually one of the ones that we have record of for very, very long back in human history. So even the oldest recorded use of alcohol goes back to, say, ancient ancestors who would eat fruits that had been on the ground long enough to ferment. And we even see that eating fermented fruits, intentionality can be debated, but maybe intentionally, in other species like elephants, which is very interesting.
I actually have kind of a related story on that. In the area that I live in, we have a bunch of trees with like red berries on them, and the magpies eat them, and then they seem like they run rapid. It's pretty weird.
I would not be surprised by that. Magpies are in the corvid family, and the whole bunch of them are probably smarter than they should be. But yeah, it's very interesting. So with alcohol, we're specifically looking at ethanol. That's one of those issues where if people are manufacturing their own alcohol, they have to be very, very careful they don't end up with methanol. Eth meaning two in chemical speak, and then methanol would be just one. And it's looking at, I'm trying to remember, it's been a long time since I took chemistry, but I think it has to do with sort of the carbon chains, maybe? Or something in that realm. But if you go too short, if you only go one long, then it can actually cause blindness and a whole bunch of other problematic things. That was one of the issues with things like moonshine, when people would make their own alcohol, especially during Prohibition, when it was illegal to have alcohol. People would be making their own stills, and if they did it incorrectly, it can cause lots of problems. Ethanol has slightly longer chain, less detrimental, but still has lots and lots of side effects here. And so that's what we're going to focus in on very briefly, is how alcohol works. And we've already hinted at the fact that people can have really, really severe reactions to withdrawal from alcohol. And it might have occurred to you, it might not have, but as a depressant, that seems to be counterintuitive for how alcohol acts. So typically people tend to imbibe because they want to sort of be a little bit more outgoing, they want to be more social. And a lot of that comes from the early effects of many depressants, including alcohol, is that they start depressing especially your higher cognitive functions. So things like inhibitions, they reduce your ability to inhibit social actions. So that's part of the anxiety reduction, where you no longer feel anxious about things, things don't appear as scary, but also you don't hold back, which makes sense if you've interacted with any amount of drunk people. And so that's why, even though it's a depressant, people have an initial almost rush of energy and sort of outgoingness and a complete change in their personality. And it's because there's still sort of this depressing action going on, but it's depressing those parts of our brain that would keep us from acting out. As time goes on, and as we have more of it in our system, that's when it starts causing problems. And in extreme cases, too much alcohol can actually depress some of our core bodily functions at sort of the base of our brain and into our brainstem. So too much alcohol could depress your ability to breathe, or sort of regulate your own body, which can, of course, be very problematic. So at the low doses, it does a good job as being a disinhibitor and a lubricant of social interactions. At higher doses, we sort of lean into that sedative and hypnotic effect, so a lot of people get really tired after a while, and very, very calm, and it can get too calm if it starts causing problems. And we're going to talk in just a couple of slides about the fact that alcohol and a bunch of other depressants seem to interfere with glutamate and GABA, which are two neurotransmitters that we have quite a bit of in the brain. And so glutamate was one of the most common excitatory neurotransmitters that we mentioned very, very briefly earlier on. And we also have that GABA, or gamma aminobutyric acid, which I will never say again, I hope. But we'll look at the receptor for GABA and how alcohol can bind to that, as well as other depressants and how that can kind of lead to some problems down the line. But we can talk very specifically about that severe reaction to withdrawal from alcohol, and they have a name for it, and this is delirium tremens. So that severe reaction to withdrawal from alcohol can come with hallucinations, delusions, confusion, and when it's really, really bad, it can come with seizures and even death. So when I was mentioning that withdrawal from alcohol can be even more severe than heroin, this is why. And when we look at that particular binding site for GABA, those GABA receptors, we might start seeing why this can be the case. And a lot of this, if you keep framing it in terms of our body getting used to or building a tolerance to these foreign substances, finding a new balance, and then when we remove that substance, the body continues producing those compensatory responses despite the lack of drug effects. So we kind of get pushed too far in the other direction. So that's a lot of what's driving some of these withdrawal effects. But first, let's talk about our barbiturates and benzodiazepines. Barbiturates are drugs that, again, when they're in lower amounts, they're going to act on those higher cortical centers, so our higher functioning, especially those involved in inhibiting behavior. So you can see why this might be appealing for people if they want to be a little bit more social, if they want to be more outgoing, if they want to be able to interact with others. This might be appealing in very low doses. Same reason why some people will have a few drinks socially. But of course, in higher amounts, they can start having those sedative and hypnotic effects. And they were intentionally used to try and treat things like insomnia and to prevent seizures, but they could again overdo it. So too much sedating can affect those parts of your brain that are involved in critical life functions. In the prescribed doses, they weren't problematic, but people built up a tolerance very, very quickly and started taking more and more of them, and it was a very fine line between what was sort of necessary to produce a effect and what could suppress all of your functioning in the nervous system. So it became problematic because of tolerance. So a lot of times, especially nowadays, they'll only be prescribed for very short periods of time because they have that ability to build up tolerance very, very quickly. All right. Actually, yeah, let's hop ahead so I can keep talking about barbiturates in just a minute. But this is the receptor that I was talking about. This is one of our GABA receptors, specifically a GABA-A receptor complex. And all that means is that it's one of a couple of different kinds of receptors that will bind to GABA. And this should look fairly familiar as a protein ion channel. So this is going through our cell membrane, and it's going to be selectively allowing things to pass through that cell membrane. And so now from this diagram, we can see that it's a complex. It has 5 different protein subunits. That's not super important. That just sort of tells us how it's put together. But having multiple of those subunits, they have lots of different receptor sites. So we have the GABA receptor site, the sort of red squiggle. We have a barbiturate receptor site, a benzodiazepine receptor site, and an alcohol receptor site. And we can see from the image that this allows chlorine ions, those Cl negatives, into the cell. And when we were talking about our neuron firing, we mostly focused on our positive ions. We were focused on our sodium and potassium. We kind of hand-waved the existence of these chlorine ions. And so here we're having this, so the inside of the cell is slightly more negative simply because it has fewer positive charges. But we might think that, okay, well, if there are less chlorines inside the cell, then just through force of diffusion, chlorine would still want to come into the cell. So this is an ion channel, so it's not a pump, it's not forcing them against a gradient, It's just when it opens, so when it binds and allows those to flow across, it's allowing them to move from an area of high concentration and low concentration. It seems kind of weird that negatives would be going into that more negative inside of the cell, but if there's a higher concentration of chlorine outside, and if that sort of more negative inside versus outside is set up mostly by those positive ions, we can kind of make sense of it. And what's going on here specifically, the way that we care about this, is that GABA would be the thing that usually binds to this to activate it. Binds, it opens the channel, it allows some chlorine to flood into the cell. That is going to make the inside even more negative, so it's hyperpolarized. It's going to make it less likely for this particular neuron to fire. When alcohol binds to that receptor site, it doesn't activate the channel on its own. Alcohol just makes it more more likely or more appealing for GABA to bind to this receptor site. So it increases the effectiveness of GABA. So it is an agonist here because it's making that neurotransmitter more effective. It's making it more intense. So when alcohol binds, we'll have more of that inhibiting happening, so less likely to fire the cell because it makes GABA more effective. Our barbiturates, which we just talked about, are a little bit special because they don't act the same way that alcohol does. What they do is they effectively take the role of GABA. So if a barbiturate binds to its receptor site, it triggers that channel to open all on its own. So it doesn't make GABA more effective, it binds in addition to GABA. And this is one of those reasons why, so this particular ion channel and its binding sites is why it's so dangerous to mix different kinds of depressants. Because if you had alcohol in your system and you took a barbiturate, then you are double inhibiting that system because they act at different places on the same receptor. So you can end up with a very, very hyperpolarized set of neurons, so it would be really hard to fire even if you needed them to. So this is how we can start suppressing some of those areas of the brain that are involved in important functions like breathing. And then our last of these is the benzodiazepines. And so they're going to act at their own receptor on that GABA-A complex. And these are mostly used for anxiety reduction and sedation, so a little bit less of that social inhibitions going away. So it's more of a trying to relax and calm yourself overall. But it does sort of work in the same way, in the same areas, and acts on that exact same ion channel. I just want to check if I made any other notes here. And so these are sort of like a middle ground. They don't actually open that ion channel on their own the same way the barbiturates do. The benzodiazepines act a lot more like alcohol, where they can bind to it and affect that and make it sort of more likely for other things to come and bind, but they themselves don't have the power to open that channel by themselves. So the barbiturates are a lot more potentially dangerous, and especially if they're mixed with other kinds of depressants that act in the same area. And we could talk quite a bit more about that, but I think that's sufficient. I'm just going to keep an eye on the time here and our slides. I think we're doing good. So our next category are stimulants. And so we're going to go from sort of our pain-relieving opioids into our depressants. And now we're going to swing the other way entirely and go into stimulants. So for stimulants, instead of depressing our central nervous system, we are now activating our central nervous system. So it can produce arousal, increased alertness, and elevated mood. And I don't know if we've had this conversation in this class before, but a lot of times when texts talk about arousal, it isn't always specifically sexual arousal. It's usually just a general state of increased energy. I learned this because someone in our lab was doing a study on whether chickadees can detect increased arousal levels in other species. So we were showing chickadees or crocodiles, ravens, pandas, all sorts of random weird animals. And we were asking them, can you tell which ones are upset versus non-upset? But the term for it, the proper term, was high and low arousal. So it just comes from sort of energy levels. So when we talk about arousal, if it is specifically sexual arousal, that will be specified. This is just general higher levels of activity. I just always point that out because I didn't have that explained to me despite many years as an undergraduate in lots of bio classes, and I was very confused by that project when we started. But for our stimulants here, we have a couple of the big names, cocaine, amphetamines, nicotine, and caffeine. And you'll notice that we have this nice balance between sort of legal and illegal drugs. And we'll start noticing that the ones that are legal aren't necessarily the ones that are less harmful, as we've already started seeing with alcohol withdrawal and how problematic that can be. Our textbook goes into far more detail on that and even talks about sort of the monetary cost to the government systems from alcohol and how extensive that is, but we don't have time to go into that much detail. So instead, we're going to focus on our different categories of stimulants very, very briefly. So the first is cocaine, and this is extracted from the coca plant, and it's desired because it produces euphoria, that feeling really, really good. It also decreases appetite, increases alertness, and relieves fatigue. So this is really beneficial for people who maybe work a lot. Maybe they don't want to have to stop to eat. Maybe they want to always be awake. This is sort of like caffeine, but on steroids. So it's a lot more intensive. And so it can be taken as a powder. It can be sort of converted and smoked. There's a whole bunch of different ways that it can be used. We also have, actually, let me double check if I had anything else I wanted to see here. Oh yes, they also briefly mention crack cocaine as a slightly less pure solid form of cocaine that can still produce pure cocaine vapors when smoked. So that's why even though it's impure, it still has the same basic effects when prepared properly. Oh, I did not mean to scroll that way. One of the downsides of using a small laptop where my notes are very condensed. With these stimulants, and specifically with cocaine, we have an issue here that we haven't encountered before, or at least that we haven't talked too much about. And this is selective tolerance. So what happens here is that instead of our body sort of compensating equally to all of the different aspects of a particular drug, with cocaine especially, our body will only develop tolerance to certain aspects of that particular drug. So in this case, we might have sort of tolerance to things that are sort of beneficial. So we might start ignoring some of the sort of reduced fatigue or increased good feelings, but things like decreased appetite would continue to happen. And so this can start leading to seizures where individuals would increase their dosages to get more of those good feelings, but instead of getting sort of the same amount of bad feelings that go with those negatives, they would get more and more intense side effects. So that can be especially problematic. And that actually reminded me of one other thing I could have mentioned when we were talking about those GABA receptors and alcohol. With those GABA receptors, because that's sort of inhibiting that firing, it's making those neurons more negative, then our body in a compensation might start producing less GABA so that there would be less activation, so there'd be less inhibition and so on. And that sort of imbalance in the production of different neurotransmitters is what can lead to some of those seizures in the severe alcohol withdrawal. So there would be a decrease in the production of that neurotransmitter, but also lacking the alcohol that makes those receptors more sensitive to what little is there, would mean that we'd have very little ability to have them function normally. Okay, I think that was all I wanted to say on that. Next we can talk about amphetamines. So these are sort of, again, more of a refined synthetic type of drug. We're still focusing on that euphoria. And in this case, we have an increase in confidence and concentration. So people feel better about themselves and they can be more focused on a task, which could again be beneficial in a workplace, especially if you're doing something like sales where you have to interact with people. So that could be one of those things that makes it very appealing. So there are lots and lots of different sort of derivatives of this. We can look at meth, speed, crack, crystal meth. All of these are different sort of subcategories. And it can be purified in different ways. And because of a lot of these things here, it can also, we mentioned, so euphoria can also end up reducing fatigue and increasing alertness. All those things that our stimulants do. Interestingly, the effects of cocaine and amphetamines are so similar that even a regular user of one or the other couldn't necessarily differentiate between the two if they were injected without knowing. The text does not specify how they know this. I'm assuming some of those 60s experiments before they had really good ethics were probably involved. But I always find it interesting when they make mention of things that they know, but don't necessarily talk about how. For this one, we have some indications of how long-term use can affect the body. And for amphetamines, long-term use can reduce our gray matter and even our hippocampus tissues, so we can have sort of a reduction in brain volume, which of course would be problematic. And then the last one on this slide, bath salts, is another type of synthetic drug. And this is bath salts. You really didn't hear much about these until probably the last 10 years or so. It was one of those sort of designer drugs and people were trying to label it in a particular way. It isn't, in fact, actual salts that you would put in the bath. Which I didn't know until fairly recently, I must say. But it's one of those naming techniques, I guess, where they would name it something innocuous so that they could talk about it. And then when people mentioned it in media, they just didn't explain the difference between the drug versus the actual type of bath salt. So not actual salts for your bath, but just a strangely named drug that was given that name to be a little bit misleading. And this one has some really bad side effects. This is the one that you would have heard about in the news, leading to psychosis, delirium, and violence. So people can sort of overindulge, and that's when we had those stories of people attacking others, sort of fighting them, eating their faces, all of that stuff. That would be from psychosis and delirium, as well as that increased aggression. So overall, a pretty awful thing. And the text doesn't actually list any of the goods that go along with this one, so whereas the others are like, yes, it can relieve fatigue, it can make you more alert. This one is just bad, is what I've figured out. Our next slide are the legal stimulants, so nicotine and caffeine. So nicotine is the primary psychoactive and addictive agent in tobacco. So it's the thing that makes tobacco appealing to people, but also addictive when people use it. And then caffeine is the addictive agent in coffee and tea. It produces arousal, increases alertness, decreases sleepiness. So for early morning classes, that's what people tend to take. I hadn't thought about that when I prepared a travel mug of coffee this morning, but that is my caffeine for the day. So we know sort of the basics of nicotine. Most people nowadays would take it in a vapor form, whether by burning cigarettes or some kind of vaping. That's another one of those things where I've started to see textbooks transition over from just smoking cigarettes to also including some information on vaping, though nicotine isn't the only substance that can be used in a vaping setting. It is sort of one of the original reasons to do it because people thought it was healthier. As more research is coming out, that's becoming more and more questionable. I'm kind of interested to see what they start saying, but so far it looks like vaping might be more harmful than smoking, which would be exactly the opposite of what they originally intended.
There is also another type of vaping, it's called dry herb vaping, where you put it in like a chamber that vaporizes the chemicals, but it doesn't combust it. So that way is actually a little safer because you're not getting the combustion chemicals.
Interesting. Yeah, that's one of those ones where I'm like, the textbooks are always probably about 10 years behind. Like, they still talk about chewing tobacco, which is very not commonly seen.
That's in Alberta.
Yeah, that was one of those eye-opening moments. But yeah, I do find that the textbook lag by about 10 years or so, which is really unfortunate because I've had to adjust, especially when we get into things like marijuana. That is one of those things where it's still listed as the most widely used illegal substance. Like, depending on where you're being used.
There's a lot of science behind marijuana, especially in the legal market too.
Yeah, and it's nice to see that they're doing proper research on a lot of these now, because it used to be a lot of sort of misinformation and people trying to push an agenda and stuff like that. But even I think I've mentioned it in my statistics class, methods in statistics, we focus on sort of that causal relationship between smoking and lung cancer as one of those rare cases where they used correlational studies plus in order to show that relationship, where they've spent like decades doing the necessary research and ruling out all of the other possible third variables and doing all of that background stuff to do the science properly, and still have a correlational study that gives us a causal effect. But I spend an entire chapter going through how they do that, which is why we still stick with the whole causal studies almost always, correlational studies will almost never be causal, because very few people are willing to put that kind of time and effort into that kind of a setup. But oh boy, is it extensive. And they're finding nowadays that with the push for legalization of marijuana, we're getting a lot of a very similar setup where people are willing to put in this effort because they want to show that marijuana use isn't as harmful as some other things that are legal, things like alcohol and nicotine. And so that's one of the big driving factors for legalization in Canada and probably in a lot of other places in the next couple of years. But yeah, that was a little bit of a tangent, but as I said, this is a very interesting chapter, especially the lack of negative framing for a lot of this. It's just sort of interest's sake. Where was I? Oh, okay. So, make sure I don't scroll too far here. So, with nicotine, that's a lot of people choose to use nicotine because it is fairly calming, which is weird, again, with our stimulants kind of seeming to do the opposite, but it gives us a little bit of tranquilizing sensation because it's desensitizing our receptors. So basically what's going on is while you're exposed to that nicotine, all of your receptors are being stimulated, and then we have habituation to that, where they're so used to being activated that they reduce their responding. So when you are no longer actively smoking, everything kind of slows down. So the slowdown comes because of overstimulation briefly beforehand. And so here with withdrawal, we have that issue where because it helps reduce anxiety, withdrawal from it can end up causing anxiety. Basically, whatever the benefits are, when you go off of that substance, you have the exact opposite. So anxiety, lightheadedness, headaches, drowsiness, all of those are fairly common side effects. And It's interesting with smoking, a lot of people have fairly high usage. So when they're awake, people tend to have at least one cigarette every hour once they have a pretty intense habit. But also most of them also want to quit. So about 68% of adult smokers in North America want to quit. And about half of them have tried to quit at least once a year, which is pretty high. And that might have something to do with all of the campaigns highlighting the sort of downsides and the health issues and that sort of thing.
My mom used to smoke. She's actually quit a couple of times. But she told me that the first time that she quit, while she wasn't smoking, she would have a lot of suicidal tendencies. She didn't see that life was learning, like everything was like really bad. And I think that probably came from this job.
Yeah, it's intense. It's and like only about 7% of people successfully quit. And even once they've quit, there's still that psychological aspect where they're like, I remember how relaxing it was. I'd like to get that again. And that's why a lot of people start looking for something to sort of replace it or fill that void. That's one of the major reasons why vaping was so popular at first. That's why it was targeted that way, was as a healthy alternative to this. And we'll see how much more of that comes about. I think if it was better regulated, it could do what it was intended to do. But with a lot of smoking, most of the damage ends up coming from other stuff that's involved. So it's not necessarily the nicotine itself that's causing all the damage. It's the process of smoking it that's causing a lot of the damage. And that's why when people say use nicotine patches or something like that, they can have some of the benefits without a lot of those negative chemical side effects. And there are some pretty intense ones here because in a lot of cases you're inhaling something directly into the lungs that gets it very quickly into the bloodstream with minimal filtering. And a lot of sort of burned chemicals, a lot of that stuff ends up creating sort of DNA mutation, or what are they called? Mutagens. Things that can cause DNA mutations. There we go. So it can lead to increased rates of cancer, especially in the areas directly affected, hence the lungs, but also to the rest of the body. And it can also cause a lot of problems with the brain as well, because those substances are going straight into the bloodstream and then can get filtered towards the brain. All right. And then I guess we can talk at the very end here about caffeine. This is, as we said, it's usually used to try and stay alert, to get rid of sleepiness, to be more active in the mornings. This is one of the most widely consumed substances that could be classified as a drug because most people will have 1 or 2 cups of coffee a day. I was one of the rare cases where I made it to my 5th year of my PhD before I started drinking coffee, which was absolutely unheard of. But then pandemic happened, so I now drink 1 cup a day. But it's one of those things where most people, especially in our lab, our supervisor provided a coffee machine in each of our offices. So if you wanted coffee, you could have coffee. And it was sort of a bonding thing. So there may be health benefits with caffeine consumption, but as with everything, it's in moderation. If taken too far, it can cause a lot of problems. There is sort of some mention of it can be lethal if taken in large enough amounts, but you would have to drink the equivalent of like 72 cups of coffee. So that's not really something that's viable to occur. It's a lot more likely now that we have sort of higher concentration caffeine things like energy drinks or caffeine pills. So those can be problematic, especially if people take them very, very quickly. But again, we can have that tolerance where you start with a cup of coffee and then you're still tired in the morning. So maybe now you have 2, and maybe you're still tired. So now you have 3. So you can build up that tolerance fairly quickly. And the withdrawal for it, because it's the opposite of those benefits, it ends up causing a lot of problems. So things like fatigue and shakiness and anxiety and headaches. So it can be very unappealing to stop drinking something like coffee, especially when the benefits seem to be pretty good. Though, as someone who, if I have more than a cup of coffee, I get shaky and jittery, so that's never a good thing. I will sip my single cup of coffee all morning, thank you. But yeah, so that's a pretty decent summary there. And then the next section, we're going to get into our psychedelic drugs, but I think what I'm going to do is leave those till next time, and we can kind of keep going there, and we'll have, I'm sure, a very interesting discussion about marijuana, which we might argue as being a psychedelic drug and might not, but that'll be a Thursday discussion.